There is a moment, quiet, unannounced, when absence finally becomes louder than presence ever was. It doesn't arrive when you leave. It doesn't come during the arguments, the silence, or the final goodbye. It arrives later, when the noise of distraction fades, when the world no longer fills the space you once occupied. That is the moment he felt your absence. Not as loss, but as an awakening. Not as regret at first, but as confusion. Because what he lost was not just you. It was the part of himself that only existed when you were there. Absence is not merely the removal of a person from a physical space. It is the sudden collapse of a psychological structure that once operated silently in the background of the mind. When someone is present for long enough, their presence becomes woven into the unconscious rhythms of daily life. It is no longer perceived as something external, something separate that must be acknowledged. It becomes assumed, taken for granted not out of cruelty, but out of familiarity. The human psyche is remarkably adaptive, and it quickly normalizes what is constant. What is constant fades from conscious awareness, and so presence, when uninterrupted, loses its sharpness, its perceived value, its urgency. While someone is there, the mind does not ask what life would feel like without them. It does not rehearse loss when comfort is guaranteed. Emotional security dulls the edge of awareness. This is why gratitude often feels abstract in the moment, and why understanding arrives late. Presence feels ordinary precisely because it is reliable. The psyche, designed to focus on threats and changes, does not highlight stability. It highlights disruption. And so awareness sleeps while presence remains. Then absence arrives, not dramatically at first, not always with grief or tears. Sometimes it enters quietly, disguised as space, as freedom, as relief. The mind initially interprets absence as neutrality, but neutrality does not last. Slowly, the unconscious begins to surface what presence had been silently carrying. Emotional gaps appear where emotional labor once lived. Silence grows heavier because it is no longer shared. The smallest routines begin to fracture, and with them, awareness awakens. This awakening is not intellectual, it is visceral. It happens when the mind reaches for something familiar and finds nothing there. When an instinctive impulse, sharing a thought, seeking reassurance, expecting understanding, meets emptiness. That moment creates friction between expectation and reality, and it is within that friction that awareness is born. The psyche begins to realize that something essential is missing, not because it was loud, but because it was foundational. Presence had been doing invisible work. It had been regulating emotion, offering continuity, providing a sense of being witnessed. Psychological studies on attachment show that consistent emotional presence reduces cognitive load. When someone reliable is there, the mind expends less energy monitoring the environment for emotional safety. In their absence, the mind must suddenly compensate. Fatigue increases. Restlessness appears. The individual feels unsettled without fully understanding why. This is often when memory begins to change. While presence existed, the mind focused on imperfections, on frustrations, on what was lacking. Absence reverses this lens. The psyche is not dishonest here, it is integrative. It begins to retrieve moments of warmth, of grounding, of quiet support. Not because the past was perfect, but because those moments served a psychological function that is now exposed by their absence. The mind becomes aware not of what the person failed to be, but of what they consistently provided. Awareness deepens further when absence removes the mirror through which the self was reflected. Identity is not formed in isolation. It is shaped relationally. Who we are is reinforced by how we are seen. When someone was present, they affirmed certain qualities, competence, kindness, worth. Their reactions subtly sculpted self-perception. Without them, the reflection disappears. The individual looks inward and finds uncertainty where confidence once existed. This confusion is often misinterpreted as missing the other person, but at a deeper level, it is the shock of encountering an unfamiliar version of the self. In everyday life, this appears in simple but powerful ways. Decisions feel heavier, motivation weakens, small successes feel strangely hollow, because there is no one who understands their significance in the same way. Research on social validation confirms that shared meaning amplifies emotional reward. When meaning is no longer shared, experiences lose intensity. Awareness dawns again. Presence had been amplifying life itself. Absence also dismantles illusions of replaceability. While someone was there, the mind categorized them as one among many possible connections. But absence tests this belief. New interactions feel thinner. Conversations lack depth. Emotional resonance feels delayed or absent. This contrast sharpens awareness. The psyche begins to understand that not all presences serve the same psychological role. Some connections are not interchangeable because they are not merely social, they are symbolic. They carry history, understanding, and emotional attunement that cannot be replicated quickly, if at all. This realization often arrives during moments of solitude. Not chosen solitude, but imposed silence. Distraction can postpone awareness, but it cannot eliminate it. Eventually, the mind grows tired of noise. In quiet moments, late nights, early mornings, moments of vulnerability, the absence becomes undeniable. The nervous system searches for regulation and finds none. Anxiety increases not because of danger, but because of disconnection. Awareness sharpens presence, had been calming the internal world without announcing itself. What makes this awareness painful is not just loss, but recognition. Recognition that value was always there, quietly sustaining, quietly stabilizing. The psyche does not punish here, it teaches. Absence functions as a psychological contrast agent, revealing what presence concealed through consistency. This is why people often say they only understood someone's importance after they were gone. Understanding requires contrast, and contrast requires absence. Yet within this awakening lies transformation. Awareness, once forced, cannot be undone. The individual begins to see relationships differently. They become more conscious of emotional labor, of subtle support, of the invisible ways people contribute to inner stability. Absence rewires perception. It strips away complacency and replaces it with clarity. What was once background becomes foreground in memory and understanding. This awareness is not meant to imprison the mind in regret. It is meant to mature it. The psyche learns that presence is not loud, not dramatic, not constant intensity. It is reliability. It is emotional availability. It is the quiet assurance that someone is there. And when that is gone, the mind finally understands its worth. Absence, then, is not merely emptiness. It is a revelation. It forces awareness where familiarity once dulled perception. It awakens the psyche to truths that presence, by its very nature, could not teach. And once this awareness is born, it changes how the individual loves, values, and recognizes what truly matters long before it disappears again. When someone is deeply present in our lives, they do more than occupy time or space. They participate in the shaping of who we believe ourselves to be. Human identity is not constructed in isolation. It is formed, adjusted, and refined through relationship. We discover our strengths, our softness, and even our hidden potential through the eyes of those who truly see us. When that person is gone, the loss is not only external. Something internal fractures as well. He believed he was self-made, that his confidence, his direction, his sense of worth came solely from within. This belief is comforting because it supports the illusion of complete independence. But the psyche is relational by nature. We become ourselves in dialogue, in recognition, in reflection. While she was there, she acted as a living mirror, reflecting back qualities he rarely acknowledged on his own. Through her presence, he felt capable without needing to prove it, valuable without performing, grounded without explanation. He did not notice this gift because it felt natural. Mirrors are not questioned when they are always available. In her gaze, he saw a version of himself that was calmer, more generous, more emotionally alive. When he doubted, her belief steadied him. When he faltered, her understanding softened his self-judgment. This was not flattery, it was recognition. She did not invent his better self, she revealed it. Psychological research supports this dynamic. Individuals consistently show higher self-efficacy and emotional regulation when they feel accurately understood by a close partner. Feeling seen stabilizes the inner world. While she remained, he unconsciously leaned into that reflection. It allowed him to grow without strain. He felt more himself, not because he was changing, but because parts of him that had been dormant were allowed to exist openly. Her presence created an environment where his better qualities were reinforced through subtle affirmation. This reinforcement became internalized. Over time, he confused the reflection with the source. He assumed the strength he felt belonged entirely to him. Then the mirror disappeared. At first, he noticed only the absence of her voice, her gestures, her physical presence. But soon, a deeper confusion emerged. The confidence that once felt effortless now required effort. The clarity he once had began to blur. Decisions felt heavier. His emotional responses became sharper or more withdrawn. He did not immediately associate this shift with her absence. Instead, he questioned himself. What changed? Why does everything feel slightly off? Without the mirror, he was left alone with his unfiltered self-perception. And self-perception, when unsupported, tends to distort. The mind fills gaps with doubt. Where affirmation once existed, self-criticism grows. Where warmth once reflected back, emotional coldness sets in. He began to notice that he no longer recognized himself in the same way. Not because he had become worse, but because the part of him that felt whole had lost its witness. This loss is deeply unsettling because it threatens identity. We rely on mirrors not only to see how we look, but to know who we are. When that reflection vanishes, the psyche scrambles to reconstruct itself. He tried replacing her presence with distraction, achievement, new faces, external validation. But these offered only fragmented reflections. None carried the history, the understanding, the emotional attunement she once provided. They showed him pieces, not depth. Real life examples echo this experience. People often describe feeling like a different version of themselves after losing someone meaningful. Not weaker, but less integrated, less coherent. Neuroscience explains this as a disruption in co-regulation. When two people emotionally attune over time, their nervous systems adapt to one another. Remove one, and the remaining system must relearn balance. Until it does, instability persists. As time passed, memory reframed itself. He began recalling moments when she encouraged him to speak more honestly, to act with integrity, to soften his defensiveness. He remembered how, around her, he was more patient, more thoughtful, more human. These memories did not arrive as nostalgia alone, they arrived as insight. He began to understand that she had been holding up a mirror not to flatter him, but to remind him of who he could be. This realization carried both pain and growth. Pain, because it revealed what he had underestimated. Growth, because it revealed responsibility. The mirror did not create his better self, but it allowed him to see it clearly. Now, without it, he faced a choice: regress into resentment and blame, or internalize what the mirror had once shown him. Slowly, awareness matured. He recognized that her presence had offered psychological safety. In that safety, he allowed himself to expand. Without it, he contracted. This contraction was not failure, it was a signal pointing toward what had mattered, toward what had nurtured him in ways he never named. He also realized something humbling. She did not lose him in the same way he lost her. She carried her mirror within herself. Her sense of self did not depend on being reflected. She knew who she was, with or without witnesses. This contrast sharpened his understanding even further. What he lost was not only a person, but a dynamic he had relied on without reciprocity. Eventually, he began the slow work of integration. He started asking himself different questions. Not how to replace her, but how to embody what she once reflected. How to become the person he was when he felt seen. This process was uncomfortable, requiring honesty and self-confrontation. But it was also transformative. The mirror, though gone, had left an imprint. He learned that true reflection, once experienced, changes the psyche permanently. Even in absence, it continues to shape awareness. He could no longer pretend he did not know his own capacity for depth, kindness, or emotional presence. The loss stripped away illusion, but it also offered clarity. In losing the mirror that reflected his better self, he was forced to confront both his dependency and his potential. And in that confrontation, something real began to form, not a replacement, not a repetition of the past, but a more conscious understanding of who he was and who he was capable of becoming. Pain rarely announces itself the moment it is born. It waits. It observes. It allows the mind to construct barriers, to stack noise upon noise, to believe that movement is healing and business is strength. Distraction feels productive. It feels like survival. In the early moments after loss, distraction even feels wise. The psyche reaches for activity, not because it is shallow, but because it is overwhelmed. When something meaningful ends, the inner world fractures, and the mind instinctively tries to protect itself from being flooded. So it fills the space. Work expands. Screens glow longer into the night. Conversations multiply but grow thinner. Laughter appears, but it does not linger. Distraction delays pain by design. In those first stages, he convinced himself he was fine. He told himself that life was moving forward, that time was doing its job, that the absence no longer mattered. Each task completed felt like proof. Each day filled with plans felt like progress. The mind equates movement with healing, Because stillness feels dangerous. Stillness threatens to open doors that have been quickly shut. And so he stayed in motion. Psychologically, this is not denial, it is postponement. Studies on grief and emotional loss show that avoidance does not erase pain, it simply stores it. The nervous system, when overstimulated, chooses distraction to maintain functioning. Pain is not eliminated, only suspended. It waits beneath the surface, patient and undisturbed, gathering clarity. At night, when exhaustion softened his defenses, the cracks began to appear. A song would land differently. A quiet drive would feel heavier than expected. A fleeting memory would surface without invitation. He dismissed these moments as random, insignificant. He believed that as long as he stayed busy, they would fade. But they did not fade, they accumulated. Distraction works only while it is sustained. The moment it stops, silence enters, and silence is not empty. Silence is an amplifier. It removes external input and forces the psyche to turn inward. What had been muted by noise suddenly grows audible. This is why silence feels uncomfortable to those carrying unprocessed emotion. It is not the absence of sound that hurts, it is the presence of truth. The first true encounter with silence often arrives unexpectedly. Perhaps during a late evening when the world slows, or early morning before the day begins. The phone is down, the room is still, and suddenly, there is nothing to hold the mind away from itself. In that moment, the pain he had delayed steps forward, not violently, but decisively. It does not accuse, it reveals. He begins to feel not just sadness, but recognition. The mind replays moments not to torture him, but to integrate experience. Silence allows memory to reorganize. What once felt chaotic becomes coherent. What once felt manageable becomes meaningful. The absence he thought he had escaped now feels undeniable. Neuroscience explains this phenomenon clearly. When external stimuli decrease, the brain's default mode network becomes active. This network is responsible for self-reflection, memory consolidation, and emotional processing. Silence activates the very system distraction suppresses. In quiet moments, the mind finally does the work it was designed to do. This is why the pain feels stronger in silence. Not because it has grown, but because it is finally being felt fully. Distraction kept it fragmented. Silence delivers it whole. He realizes then that what he missed was not only the person, but the emotional regulation their presence provided. Conversations he once took for granted had been grounding. Shared silences had been comforting. The simple knowledge that someone was there had calmed his nervous system. Without that, silence feels unfamiliar, even threatening. It mirrors the absence itself. Real-life stories echo this experience repeatedly. People describe how grief or loss felt manageable during busy periods, only to surge during quiet holidays, late nights, or moments of rest. The pain was always there, but only silence allowed it to surface with clarity. Silence does not create pain, it delivers awareness. As he sits with it, something shifts. The pain is no longer chaotic, it becomes informative. He begins to understand what mattered, what nourished him, what he lost not in arguments or endings, but in everyday presence. Silence teaches him the emotional cost of what is gone. There is fear in this stage. Fear that if he stops distracting himself, the pain will overwhelm him. But something unexpected happens. The more he allows silence, the more the pain begins to transform. It does not disappear, but it changes shape. It becomes less sharp, more grounded. It becomes sadness with meaning rather than anxiety without direction. This is the paradox of silence. What feels like collapse is actually integration. What feels like weakness is emotional processing. Silence does not break him, it reveals him. It shows him that distraction was never healing, only postponing. Healing begins where avoidance ends. In silence, he also encounters parts of himself he had neglected. Regret surfaces, but so does honesty. Longing appears, but so does gratitude. He begins to see the relationship not through the lens of loss alone, but through understanding. He recognizes patterns, his own defenses, his own emotional habits. Silence gives space for responsibility without condemnation. Gradually, the pain softens into insight. He understands that distraction kept him functional, but silence makes him whole. That noise protected him, but quiet teaches him. The pain delivered by silence is not punishment, it is instruction. He learns that avoiding silence keeps one fragmented. Embracing silence, though painful, leads to coherence. The mind cannot heal what it does not feel, and what it finally feels in silence is not only loss, but depth. Depth of connection, depth of meaning, depth of self-awareness. In time, silence no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a companion, a space where memory settles, where emotion breathes, where the self reorganizes. The pain that once arrived like a wave now moves like a current, present, but navigable. Distraction delayed the pain because the psyche needed time. Silence delivered it because the psyche was ready. And in that delivery, something essential occurred. The pain was no longer something to escape, but something to listen to. And in listening, he began not only to grieve, but to grow. For a long time, he believed you were an addition to his life, something that enhanced what already existed, but was not essential to its functioning. This belief felt reasonable, even mature. Independence is praised, self-sufficiency admired. To need someone deeply is often mistaken for weakness. So he told himself that you were a supplement, pleasant, supportive, enriching, but ultimately optional. While you were there, this belief went unchallenged because life continued to move forward. He worked, planned, dreamed, struggled, succeeded. Everything appeared intact. He mistook continuity for self-sufficiency. What he did not see was the invisible role you played. You were not simply accompanying his life, you were feeding it. You were a source, quietly supplying emotional energy, stability, and meaning. Like air, your contribution was unnoticed precisely because it was constant. The psyche rarely honors what it does not have to consciously secure. It assumes what arrives effortlessly will always arrive. And so he consumed without awareness. You were the place where his thoughts could land without resistance. When the world demanded performance, you offered rest. When uncertainty crept in, you grounded him without instruction. You did not fix his problems, you made them survivable. This distinction matters. A supplement enhances performance. A source sustains existence. He confused the two because your support did not announce itself as vital. It felt natural, familiar, ordinary. Psychologically, this misjudgment is common. Humans often misinterpret emotional regulation as personal strength. When someone consistently co-regulates us, calms us, validates us, stabilizes us, we internalize the effect but forget the cause. Studies on attachment show that people in emotionally supportive bonds display lower stress responses and higher resilience. But they often attribute these qualities to themselves, not to the relationship that made them possible. He did the same. When you were there, challenges felt manageable. Even failure had a floor beneath it. He could fall and still feel held, but he never asked why falling did not break him. He never traced his resilience back to its source. He assumed it was innate. Then you were gone. At first, he felt functional. Life did not immediately collapse. This reinforced his belief. See, he thought, I am fine. I can do this alone. But slowly, something shifted. Stress felt heavier. Decisions drained him. Rest no longer restored him. The same problems he once navigated with relative ease now exhausted him. He pushed harder, thinking effort was the answer. But effort without nourishment leads only to depletion. This was the beginning of recognition. Not intellectual, but embodied. He noticed how quickly his patience wore thin, how often he felt unsettled without knowing why, how silence no longer felt neutral but tense. The inner equilibrium he once took for granted had vanished, and still, he resisted the truth. He searched for substitutes, distractions, achievements, new connections, supplements. But supplements could not do what you had done. They stimulated him, but they did not sustain him. They occupied time, but they did not replenish him. He began to understand the difference through contrast. Supplements require constant renewal. A source flows steadily. Without you, everything required more effort and yielded less return. This realization was humbling. It dismantled the story he had told himself about independence. He saw now that what he had called strength was partially borrowed. What he had called balance was partially shared. And what he had called self-sufficiency was, in truth, relational nourishment. Real, life patterns confirm this awakening. People often report burnout not after loss, but months later. The delayed collapse confuses them. They think they are failing, when in fact they are starving. Emotional sources, when removed, do not cause immediate breakdown. They cause gradual depletion. The body and mind keep going until they cannot. He began to remember moments he once dismissed as small. The way your presence softened his anxiety without words. The way conversations with you clarified his thoughts. The way simply knowing you were there made difficult days survivable. These were not luxuries. They were supplies. He had been drawing from a well he never acknowledged. What made this realization painful was not just loss, but accountability. To see someone as a supplement is to underestimate their significance. To recognize them as a source is to confront how deeply one depended on what one did not honor. This awareness stirred regret, but also respect. Respect for what you gave. Respect for what he received without conscious gratitude. He also noticed something else. You did not seem as destabilized without him. You carried your center within yourself. This contrast sharpened the lesson. You had been a source for him, but you were not sourcing yourself from him in the same way. Your strength was internally anchored. His had been relationally supported. This was not a fault. It was a truth he had never examined. In this recognition, something shifted within him. The loss stopped being only about missing you. It became about understanding relationship itself. He began to see that true connection is not decorative. It is structural. It does not merely add joy. It supports functioning. And when such a connection is lost, the task is not replacement, but integration. He realized that if he wished to grow, he would have to become a source to himself in ways he had once outsourced unconsciously. This did not mean erasing your importance. It meant honoring it by internalizing what you had modeled. Your steadiness, your emotional availability, your capacity to remain present without control. This was not an easy process. Becoming one's own source requires facing internal emptiness without fleeing from it. It requires learning to regulate emotions that were once co-regulated. It requires patience, humility, and self-confrontation. But awareness had been planted. It could not be undone. He no longer spoke of you as something he lost lightly. He understood now that you were foundational. And though the source was no longer external, its impact remained. What you gave had shaped him, nourished him. And now, it demanded responsibility. He realized, finally, that some people enter our lives not to decorate them, but to sustain them. They are not additions, they are origins. And recognizing this truth changes how one loves, how one values presence, and how one understands what it truly means to be whole. When you left, it appeared as though you had vanished from his life, as though distance and silence had erased your place within his world. This is how absence is usually understood, an ending, a removal, a clean break. But the psyche does not function according to physical boundaries. What truly matters is not governed by proximity, but by meaning. And meaning, once formed, does not disappear. It relocates. Your absence did not remove you from him, it transformed you into something far more enduring. At first, he experienced your absence as emptiness. The spaces you once occupied felt colder, quieter, stripped of warmth. He noticed it in ordinary moments, the pause before sharing a thought, the instinct to reach out and then remember there was no one to receive it. These moments felt like loss, and they were. But they were also the beginning of an internal shift. What had once existed externally began to migrate inward. The mind cannot simply release what has shaped it. Psychological bonds, especially those formed through emotional intimacy, become internal structures. Your voice, your values, your way of seeing the world had been absorbed over time. While you were present, this integration was invisible. It felt like interaction. Only in your absence did its depth become clear. He began to hear your influence not as memory alone, but as guidance within his own thoughts. He noticed it when he faced decisions. The questions he asked himself bore your imprint. The standards he held himself to echoed conversations you once had. Even in moments of weakness, there was an awareness of how you would have responded, with honesty, with steadiness, with care. This was not nostalgia, it was internalization. You had become part of his inner dialogue. Neuroscience supports this transformation. Close relationships alter neural pathways, shaping how individuals process emotion, stress, and meaning. When such a relationship ends, the pathways do not vanish, they continue to fire. The brain does not delete what it has learned, it repurposes it. Your absence forced this repurposing. What once arrived through your presence now emerged through memory, association, and inner reference. At times, this was painful. To carry someone within oneself without the ability to reach them externally creates tension. He felt you most when he grew, when he stumbled, when he confronted parts of himself he once avoided. In these moments, your influence felt undeniable. You were no longer someone he interacted with, but someone he answered to internally. This realization unsettled him at first. It felt unfair. How could absence make you more present than before? Yet this is the paradox of meaningful connection. Presence shapes behavior through interaction. Absence shapes character through integration. While you were there, your influence was supported by immediacy. When you left, it demanded ownership. He could no longer lean on your guidance directly. He had to decide whether to embody it or ignore it. In this way, absence became a test of internalization. He began to recognize patterns. When he chose honesty over avoidance, he felt aligned with something deeper. When he acted with integrity, there was a quiet sense of coherence. These moments carried your signature. Not because you instructed him, but because you had once mirrored these qualities in him. Your absence had turned those reflections into expectations he now held of himself. Real life accounts echo this phenomenon. People often report that the most influential figures in their lives continue to guide them long after they are gone. Parents, mentors, partners, those who truly mattered become internal presences. Their values persist not as rules, but as instincts. This is how influence becomes permanent. It moves from the outside world into the inner architecture of the self. He also noticed that your absence sharpened his awareness of others. He became more attentive, more sensitive to emotional undercurrents. Loss had refined his perception. What once felt automatic now required intention, and in that intention, he grew. The emptiness left by your departure became a space for reflection. Reflection became insight. Insight became change. There were moments when he wished you could see who he was becoming. Not for approval, but for acknowledgement. This longing revealed something important. You had not just been someone who loved him, you had been someone whose respect mattered. That respect, now internalized, shaped his choices. He did not want to betray the version of himself that had existed in your presence. He wanted to live up to it. Over time, grief softened into gratitude, not because the pain disappeared, but because its purpose became clear. Your absence had not diminished your significance. It had distilled it. What remained was not the noise of daily interaction, but the essence of what you represented. Stability, depth, authenticity. These were no longer things he associated only with you. They became qualities he aspired to embody. He realized that you had given him something rare. Not dependence, but orientation. You had helped him locate his moral and emotional center. Losing you forced him to navigate without external reference, but the compass you left behind still functioned. It pointed him toward growth, even when the path was difficult. This internal presence did not trap him in the past. On the contrary, it propelled him forward. He became more deliberate in his relationships, more respectful of emotional bonds. He understood now that what truly matters leaves a residue. People pass through our lives, but those who touch us deeply stay. Not as memories alone, but as structures within us. Your absence had rewritten the relationship. It was no longer about interaction, but influence. No longer about proximity, but permanence. You were no longer beside him, but within him. And in that transformation, something profound occurred. You ceased to be someone he lost and became someone he carried. This is the quiet truth of absence. It does not always erase. Sometimes it engraves. And what is engraved into the psyche does not fade with time. It evolves, guiding choices, shaping identity, and reminding the soul of what it once recognized as meaningful. The moment he felt your absence was not when you walked away. It was when life continued, and something essential did not return. Absence revealed truth, silence revealed value, loss revealed depth. And whether he ever admits it or not, your absence became the moment he finally understood who you were, and who he became because of you.